Hi, my name is Dr. David Larsen, and today we're going to be talking about swing music. So what is swing music? Swing music is a style of jazz that was popular from the 1930s and really all the way up until today. Swing is the most popular form of jazz, and typically it's the one that most people think of when they think of just jazz music. Starting in the 1930s, swing music was the answer for a younger generation who were no longer interested in traditional jazz and they wanted to put their own spin on the music. Social dancing was very popular in the United States before 1950, and so the jazz fans were looking for a way of incorporating the music that they loved with the dancing that they so enjoyed. The easiest way to think about swing music as different from traditional jazz is the swing feel. Now, both traditional jazz and swing have a swing feel to them, but the swing is a smoother, more steady beat, whereas traditional jazz has a little more of a march flavor to it. So you'll feel a little bit more of a bumpy, jerky feeling when you're listening to traditional jazz, but when you listen to swing, it has a smooth, even beat, great for dancing. The most common way that swing music ended up being presented was through the big bands, which was a large ensemble featuring 4 to 5 saxes, 3 to 4 trombones, 3 to 4 trumpets, typically a piano, a bass, a drum, and also sometimes a guitar player. Unlike traditional jazz that had a lot of influence from march music, swing music replaced the tuba with the upright bass because it was easier for the player to play that consistent driving bass line that we all know and associate with swing music. Another big change is the prevalence of piano rather than stringed instruments. Now at this time we still don't have guitar amplifiers, so guitar was still a relatively quiet instrument, and compared to 12 to 15 horn players, an unamplified guitar would be very difficult to be heard, so the louder piano offered a bigger sound palette, which worked a lot better in this particular style. The name swing comes from the idea that jazz was the music that came around 1900, popularized by Louis Armstrong, Freddie Keppard, and others, and this newer generation who were born in and around 1910 to 1920, as they became young adults in the 1930s, were looking for a way to have their music stand out from the previous generation. So they came up with the term swing rather than jazz to differentiate the two musics. This idea of hip vocabulary became so popular that musicians like Cab Calloway actually published his own dictionary of swing terms so that you could be a hep cat and get out there on the dance floor and be as cool as you possibly could. This is also the time period where the superstar musician was born. Our ideas of rock musicians trashing hotel rooms, using substances and other things actually derives from this time period because all of these same mannerisms were totally prevalent during the swing era. As the popularity of swing music grew, swing bands popped up all over the country. Pretty much any city of size had a dance band, and they would tour often in local areas and sometimes nationally. This was all helped by the newly minted radio broadcast network in the United States. Now, other forms of music had been broadcast over radio, but swing music took on an even bigger part of this, when radio stations would hire bands to play live broadcasts of music because it was still relatively difficult to play pre-recorded music on the radio. This allowed artists like Benny Goodman, Glenn Miller, Artie Shaw, and others to become superstars and commercially very successful. Benny Goodman made as much as $10,000 a week during his heyday, which even by today's standards is an awful lot of money. Coincidentally, the idea of a live radio broadcast was also a way that it popularized the music. A good example of this is Benny Goodman. He was not finding much success as a band leader in New York City when he first got there. He had grown up in Chicago and was a young clarinet virtuoso, but his band was not really finding the kinds of success that Fletcher, Henderson, and Duke Ellington were discovering. He got a live radio broadcast gig on the Let's Dance radio hour, and it was broadcast from midnight to 1 a.m. in New York City. Now, this was not a very popular time, but when Benny Goodman took a last-ditch cross-country tour, when he got to Los Angeles, he realized people had been listening to the Let's Dance radio hour, which was on at 9 p.m. in Los Angeles, and it had made him a superstar. Other great big band leaders of this era included people like Woody Herman, Artie Shaw, Jimmy Lunsford, Count Basie, Duke Ellington, and the list goes on and on. There were literally thousands of big bands performing and recording all across the United States between the 1930s and really up all the way into the 1960s. Big bands were still pretty popular up and through the 1980s, and proof of this is the popularity of the Tonight Show big band led by Doc Severinsen. Because most adults who grew up in the 1930s were now full-fledged adults with children in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, this music was still fairly popular, so bands like Maynard Ferguson, Woody Herman, and others who were in their later part of their careers still found success in touring because there was still an audience hungry for this music. Now, none of this music would be possible without the influence of Fletcher Henderson. Fletcher Henderson was the archetype of swing music, and along with his arranger Don Redman, they came up with the overall archetype for how big band jazz would be composed and arranged. His big band included the sax section, trombones, trumpets, piano, bass, and drums in the rhythm section, and he codified the idea of having these sections play independently as an ensemble, and more specifically, he would use the technique of call and response, where, say, the saxophone section would play a melody, and they would be answered by the brass, and so on and so forth. He also came up with a formula for big band hits, which would be an introduction, a melody statement, solos, a shout chorus where the band would play loud and energetic, and then some kind of melody outro at the end. And this was such a popular format that it still is used today for most big band compositions. The swing era also brought around the popularity of popular singers like Ella Fitzgerald, Billie Holiday, and others. Now, originally, big bands were so popular that the singers were just a small part of the band's presentation, and it wasn't uncommon for the band to play 2/3 of a song before the singer would actually come in. But then once Frank Sinatra became popular, he sort of turned that on its head, where the solo vocalist was now the headliner, and the band would play to the solo vocalist rather than having the solo vocalist being a part of the big band. There were also thousands of great soloists during this time period: Clark Terry, Lester Young, Coleman Hawkins, and the list goes on and on and on. It would take forever to list all of these names, but it's definitely worth taking a deep dive into some of these great performers. Swing music was also played by small groups, including Benny Goodman's quartet, and sessions with small groups led by Count Basie, Charlie Christian on guitar, and many others. Swing music is still to this day the most popular form of jazz music. There are swing groups and swing dance clubs that put on dances all around the country and around the world, and it is still popular to dance dances like the Lindy Hop. If you're looking for a great way to get into jazz music, let me tell you, swing music is the way to go. It's very accessible, it was very popular, and swing music was the thing that brought around American popular music and influenced artists in rock and roll, blues, and beyond. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.